Thanks to Miss Spudnut and K-Flan the Plan for helping with the funding for this video. If you'd like to get your own special shout out, your username in the credits, early access to videos, or other perks, consider pledging to the Patreon or Ko-fi today. The links are in the description. Your financial support will definitely help boost production on other videos to come in the future. Thank you, and enjoy. Well, seeing how the Disney brand's been around for over 100 years now, I'm sure it's fair to say a lot of us have had their childhood practically flooded with these movies. In one way or another, we've had a ton of fond nostalgic memories just from watching through one of the many choices the studio gave us throughout the century, and cherishing them even more because of that. But not me. Yeah, this may sound kinda depressing for some, but my childhood was never quite as Disney-filled as the next guy. But that's not to say I was completely devoid of Disney movies growing up. At the most, I still got to see some of the older works from Walt himself, like Pinocchio, Fantasia, 101 Dalmatians, The Jungle Book, and even Alice in Wonderland. So I still had a fairly decent experience with the legacy, all things considered, but then we have pretty much all the other movies, which at best took me years to finally decide to make time for. Meanwhile, everyone else around me had their fun quoting the heck out of these gems as they had plenty of experience with them. But I still got some more experience even beyond that. It wasn't until my high school years when I finally got to see some of those other fan favorites for myself, particularly Lilo and Stitch, Beauty and the Beast, and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And even still, after all that time too, there's still a handful of bigger staples that I still haven't got the chance to see, whether it's finishing them from beginning to end, or even seeing them at all. But now that I've put this off long enough after so many years, I figured it might be a neat little experience to see some of those classic Disney films that I probably could have seen much earlier in my life, but never really got to up until now. But then again, this might make things interesting too, as I can't really say that much off nostalgic bias because, well, you know, that won't really be the case this time around. So I picked out a few choices that I feel will make some decent candidates, and as time goes on, we'll see how I feel about each movie. So, let's move on and see how this goes. So I thought it'd be fitting to start this off with the iconic beginning to this whole legacy, Snow White. Of course, I'm talking about the original, and not that recent one. And I highly doubt I'm gonna watch that one anytime soon, if ever, because, dear Lord.
Oh my god!
So yeah, this was quite the impact for Disney's full-fledged cinema legacy, and it only took me a few days ago to finally see it for myself. But do keep in mind, I wasn't completely blind to the story. I already understood it as a whole, albeit in a very vague sense, and I got to see it play out in a variety of adaptations and reenactments in episodes of different shows. But this was the first time in my life seeing it all directly from the movie. Now, as for the movie itself, I was familiar with quite a handful of individual portions going into this too. I knew about the characters and what happened to them, I knew the song Hi-Ho and a small portion of Whistle While You Work, but aside from that, the rest of the side details were pretty new to me. That being said, this is probably going to sound like a stupid remark here, but after the years of seeing Snow White in her iconic dress, only to see her attire at the start of the movie, I feel like I just woke up and abruptly found myself in an alternate dimension. Yeah, I know it's a ridiculous take, and even in the movie's universe, she obviously wore other clothes at some other points in her life. But again, with the many forms of marketing and media showing her with that dress specifically, it was like seeing Santa Claus wearing anything other than his red suit for the first time in your life. Plus, the smaller details like this show a lot of layering between the Queen and Snow White. As she's been given a dress of dull colors like this, the Queen feels this lack of presentability may discourage Snow White from interacting with anyone else. Hearing her instinct of kindness or her looks being witnessed by anyone could cripple the Queen's chances of making her come off more fair than Snow White. Then when you see her first time meeting Prince Charming, this shows more of a nervous side towards Snow White, one that she's likely gained due to her long separation from society. However, this also comes off as the first crack in her shell, leading up to when she talks with the huntsman and the seven dwarves later on. And it also feels like this plays a part in her main outfit too, as it seems the Queen gave her this dress to make her presentable to the outside world. But unknowing to her, this also makes her ready to start a new chapter of her life on her own as she meets the dwarves shortly after. Whoa, I really have that much to say about her clothes alone? I was not expecting it would take that route. Well, anyway, there were some smaller details in this movie that feel like they were inspirations for future Disney movies they'd end up making. Either that, or there's a sense of foreshadowing in advance and they already had them planned. You can get that feeling when you see some of the background elements,
Bambi!
or even interactions among the characters themselves.
Jiminy Crickets!
A lot of this and others come off as a really nice and lively presentation, though personally there are some portions of the movie that I feel go on a bit longer than they should have been. Mainly when they stretch out details that feel like they were already shared or addressed in earlier scenes. But hey, given the time this came out, and considering this was the first movie they made on this kind of scale, I find a lot of it perfectly acceptable. Yeah, there are some scenes that may not help much for the story, but a lot makes up for it with the animation flow, expanding the atmosphere, and sharing the more musical side in all this. Though looking back at it, there's still one detail I'm confused by, and that's the dwarves' take on the queen. Yeah, it would make sense that they don't like her, but then they start to bring up her magic side. My first thought as they were going through all this was, how exactly do they know about this stuff? Sure, it's fair to say some people might have known about the magic mirror, and that's a huge might there, but anything beyond that, like the spell books and such, now those don't seem like that public of knowledge. Are they saying she's shown some of her spells to her people, or is this just a crazy hunch by Grumpy that turned out to be true? I don't know, maybe there's something I missed here or in the original story, but it just seems like a wild happenstance from out of nowhere. But still, this was a cute and nice watch for what it was. It was nice to finally see all the characters played out and the songs in their entirety. And the Queen had a fairly decent motive for this kind of story. It was also nice to see the unveiling of her iconic secret weapon. And she also had a more amusing defeat than I was expecting. While I already knew how the story was going to end, I could still feel a lot of the charm that came out of it. It comes off feeling like the kind of beauty the Disney team could never really grasp based on what we've seen in their live-action remakes. Especially the remake for this movie. No! No! So now, let's skip ahead a little to the 50s. During the previous decades by this point, there have been a handful of upgrades that were added to these movies, whether it was through the song variety, the animation, the story's pacing, or other details. Not only that, but Walt and his team have acquired the rights to a lot more stories to adapt, with one of the biggest examples at this time being Peter Pan. And just like with Snow White, I had a vague, but still somewhat linear understanding of the story going in. I heard a lot about it from different family members and was made aware of the many movies that came from it, from the remakes and the other works blooming from inspiration. Though for the longest time I was having thoughts about watching the original movie before diving into any of those others, and at one point that feeling eventually left. I guess as a kid I felt kinda hesitant about seeing the original, especially after I heard about the tragedy Bobby Driscoll, Peter's original voice actor, ended up going through, and what happened in that Chip and Dale movie much later didn't really help that situation. I don't know. For a while it just didn't seem like it would sit well with me when I knew about all this in the back of my mind. But given how iconic the Peter Pan character himself is in so many different circles, I was surprisingly curious enough to see where most of it came from. So I decided, for the sake of this video, I might as well get this out of the way, and after all this time, give it a chance to show everything fully play out. And after the first couple of scenes, one of the first thoughts I had was, ah yes, I finally caught some references I could never really pinpoint before. I can finally let some of those confusing pop-ups leave my head because I know exactly where they're coming from.
He can talk!
Though, unlike with Snow White, I wasn't as familiar with most of the details, including characters. So, of course, it took a bit longer to get them all organized. And this led to me asking questions like, wait, hold on, who's Nana again? Why do they keep mentioning her? I thought, oh, right, the dog. Okay, now I get it. And yeah, I could see a lot of the appeal in Neverland, with the space and whimsy in some areas, though I feel I should get this out of the way. So, there's that glaring aspect I think a lot of us know about at this point, and it hasn't really aged that well to say the least. And the fact it's involved with a fairly big part of the story probably doesn't help either. Like, sure, it may have seemed like a common staple at the time, though nowadays it feels more like a wave of guilt on those who saw it as a joke, or wasn't aware of how bad those terms can come off. And I should get this off my chest, like many others presumably, I was just as oblivious in my past long ago. And now I felt really awkward seeing it all now with how frequently it came charging out at certain moments here. But nowadays, I'm sure a lot of us have changed to prevent incidents like this from being such an issue now. And as long as we learn from incidents like this and try to stop them from happening again, I'm sure this is one of many things that can lead to a friendlier future moving forward. But okay, back to the positives for this movie. I happened to notice Wendy's voice actress also played the original Alice, to which she was using the exact same tone and everything.
You know, you look exactly the way I thought you would. Oh wait! Don't go, please!
But hey, I don't mind. She still seemed to pull it off well for this character. And despite what happened to Driscoll, his voice for Peter was nice too. He had that kind of friendly and quirky energy you'd expect for this kind of character. Then there's Captain Hook, who was a far more enjoyable villain than I was expecting. He had a lot of energy in his style, animation, and especially from his voice actor Hans Conried. And from further research, I noticed he was in some cartoon works that I did grow up with. Stuff like Dudley Do-Right and Dr. Seuss on the Loose, in both of which he was also fairly iconic and entertaining. Hook may have had a decent threat factor to him on his own, but what I really enjoyed was the energy and interactions he offered. He had plenty of moments that could come off amusing and memorable, whether it was with his crew and Mr. Smee or even the crocodiles.
Was that the bite of 87?
And even with the over-the-top scenes, there are some slower and sweet moments too. Like when they all share the interactions and the song going into the family matter they all have. All with the lost children wondering what could have become of their own families. It starts throwing in some of the feels when you think about them. And those feels add on at the very end as they give an implication of George having some kind of history with Hook's ship, which leaves an ending both open-ended and with a lot of sweeter directions I was expecting for this character. It leaves you thinking stuff like, maybe George had his own run-in with Captain Hook, or had a journey with Peter Pan on that very ship. Despite his doubts about Peter existing at the start, could it be possible we forgot about all that? It's fair to assume, given that it's been years since his childhood, and maybe he got reminded of whatever connections he may have had from the sight of that ship. The idea of George having seen Neverland himself was a nice, cute touch, implying that perhaps a lot of us might have similar experiences with growing up. And this over-the-top adventure is probably one of many ways to show how it feels. Eventually, we may have to leave some things behind while growing up, but we'll always have the memories that came from them. It's kind of touching when you see it that way, don't you think? So yeah, I can see where a good portion of the charm came from. Though the potential to make this many different movies? I'd say that's still TBD, fellas. But still, this provided a pretty appealing spectacle with a story a lot of people could relate to, and a world of magic, ships, fairies, and mermaids. Oh, yeah, mermaids, speaking of which... So let's jump ahead again to the 80s. I decided to start off this era with something I saw very thin snippets of for scattered years of my past, and decided to wait until now to finally put the pieces together. That being The Little Mermaid. I'll just get this out of the way first. My experience with this movie beforehand was a bit more of a maze of surprises going in. Unlike the first two movies, I haven't seen anywhere near as many adaptations of the story. Though to balance it out, I was a bit more familiar with the original Hans Christian Andersen tale itself. And that's basically where most of my context for the story came from going in. But I could already tell the ending was going to be different if nothing else. I mean, I didn't even want to imagine how they'd pull it off had they gone that route. As for the movie itself, I'll admit that, a lot like Snow White, I was mostly hesitant watching it as a kid, and that was due to my overly typical young guy thoughts back then. Oh god, a girls' movie? No way am I watching that! Well, funny how that turned out, am I right? So anyway, before going into this movie, the most I knew about it were the words to Poor Unfortunate Souls and some of Under the Sea. Aside from that, I just went into this with my usual vague understanding of the story and characters. But even though I was slightly more blind going into it, I might have still had the better experience watching through this one so far. While the earlier movies had their pluses with the flow of visuals and atmosphere, there were some huge steps forward that can be seen here. A lot was put into the shading and panning shots, and they use all the different underwater scenes as an advantage to play around with different effects and colors. The cast also had plenty of ironic, charming performances to offer. I'm sure a lot of you know Jodie Benson solely from her role as Ariel, and honestly that's one of the few character roles I also knew about her for a while now, as well as her performance in... Oh god. Ariel may have had a pretty cute design on its own, but Jodie sealed the charm with her sweet voice. I especially loved how Part of Your World played out through her performance. And my old side's about to kick in again, but Buddy Hackett's one of the other cast members I definitely recognized going into this. I've been very familiar with his material for a while now, and his goofy nature certainly fits well for Scuttle's character and aspect. And I'm sure a lot of you remember Samuel Lee Wright's delivery for Sebastian. It's a shame he passed away a few years ago, but I'm sure we'll all remember the energy he had through his wonderful voice performance and delivery for his songs we got for years to come. And the same can go for Pat Carroll as Ursula. She had a really unique style of sinister energy for this character, even outside of her song, which can really stick with you for a while after listening to her voice. Her creepy atmosphere also adds on to her display, especially seeing all her shriveled victims she's been keeping hold of. Oh, jeez. There really is a lot to her. Through her evil side and the charm she offered in her character and the portrayal from Carol as well, and apparently they loved her style to the point of bringing her back to play Morgana in the sequel, but we'll probably see how that turned out at some other point. I could go on and on about the cast, but I don't want to take up too much time on that. There's still the overall movie to talk about here. Once again, I started catching on a lot of references I never would have known came out from these scenes and songs. And seeing and hearing them unveiled at the very moment really opened up those memories where I first heard them and got me understanding what made them work in the first place. And to find out what events all came before and after those very moments ignited that same spark of closure and understanding that got me wondering for years about those original sources everyone around me's been quoting. And it also greatly helped that the executions of these songs and moments came off so grand on their own, making these realizations feel even more satisfying as I not only got the answers to the blanks in these memories, but I also found them through results that blew me away with stunning flowing visuals and impressive beautiful singing and instrumentals to back them all up. On the side, I didn't really know what to specifically expect for most of these human characters. Well, except for Eric, it was pretty obvious which direction he was gonna take. But even then, it took me a bit to figure out some things about him, like his name particularly. Yeah, that was pretty embarrassing on my end, but still, seeing him came with some satisfying outcomes. And still, he had his sweet moments with Ariel to help him stand out a little more. So on top of that, most of these details play out about the same way you'd expect in this fairy tale layout. Well, except for maybe Chef Lewis, which, I don't know, I didn't find him as memorable as some other characters. Though I'll say he did have a few of his own smaller moments. But overall, I'd say this was a greatly decided cast with neat visual direction and a surprisingly brilliant adaptation to the story. And from what I heard, this movie helped the studio in a handful of different ways. It ended up as an impressive success at the box office, and it paved the road for other animated movies they made that became huge fan favorites. So yeah, this had a lot of great outcomes to it.
Get out of here.
And while I may have had that stubborn nature as a kid, I greatly enjoyed seeing how this movie turned out nowadays. And with the kind of optimism I now have in these present years, let's see how some of these other movies turned out. Now let's twist the order a little and go into a slightly earlier movie in the timeline, particularly The Great Mouse Detective. I'll admit when I was younger, I never really thought much about this one. While I did have more availability and a bit more of an open mind toward this one as a kid, I still never really thought this was going to be anything that special growing up. So I basically just avoided this one for all these years too. But I guess what drove me to this movie most now, at least at first glance, was that it features two actors in the main cast who I strongly admired for a huge portion of my life. Alan Young as Flaversham, and Vincent Price as Ratigan. And the idea that these two childhood idols of mine were very likely going to perform together in the same movie and the same scene, it's just... oh! The idea of their iconic, charming performance styles working off each other was just enough to push me to give this whole movie a fair shot for the video. So among the first of impressions, I noticed they went with a very similar visual style to 101 Dalmatians. And wow, that brings in a load more similarities between the two than I was expecting. Considering that these are two movies in the classic Disney legacy, both with an old England setting revolving around animals with slightly similar looking character designs and expressions, and all set with this kind of visual style. Though the menacing levels of the villains in these movies can be debated. But I digress. So anyway, despite this being a little shorter and in some ways more simple and down to earth than the other movies we've been through so far here, there's still a lot to get out of something like this with pretty satisfying execution and presentation. Starting with the over-the-top portrayals we got from Basil and Ratigan. Now Ratigan may be the first villain we've seen in this bunch who doesn't resort to any magic and such, but he's still had plenty of his own ways to help him earn his place. From his towering structure and fancy design as he comes creeping out of the shadows, his many henchmice he's got on side, and the threatening resort of Felicia should anyone get on his bad side. And of course, we'll again always have the memories of Vincent Price and how he too boosted this character. Especially in those moments when we see him going from sinisterly suave to at the end of his rope in a matter of seconds. This right here, I'd say, is probably one of the best ways to see what Price was capable of during his legacy. On the other side, Basil has his own charm too. While I've never seen burying him in anything else aside from this, he also knew how to go about this character, going off his zany energy and some of it being of good use. as his character's put through some obstacles and goes about his own way to find the best solutions. He himself, and his writing too, can come off pretty smart most of the time. And speaking of smart, the feature's Sherlock references, both inside and out, really showed they had dedication to some of the older stages in the story they wanted to show. They added very brief signs showing that Sherlock does in fact exist in this scenario, and his voice was brought in by older clips of Basil Rathbone. Yeah, you see the first connection, right? Basil Rathbone, Basil? Aside from his name, Rathbone also happened to play Sherlock in those very old Holmes movies. They knew what they were doing, and it was clever and flowed naturally from multiple directions. And I'd also like to draw a bit of attention to Flaversham too. Yeah, I love his voice actor Alan Young, and I'm very familiar with him in other sources, and he gave a pretty sweet performance here too, as Flaversham risks his morals and sometimes even his own life just for the sake of keeping his daughter Olivia alive. It's got a fairly simple basis and plays out in a touching way. It's really nice. The atmosphere and story this movie had overall seems like such an open concept. I can see this going in so many directions had they extended it in any way, with the different mysteries they could put these characters through and show more ways of Basil using his smarts and quick thinking to solve issues and escape different obstacles and traps. And who knows what kind of other characters they could create for different varieties among interactions with the main characters we've come to know through this movie alone. A lot more could have come from it while it was still fresh. Perhaps they could have made a TV show for it. And, well, I could say a sequel too, but given how some of the more particular Disney sequels turned out, maybe it was for the better they left it as is. But it feels like we've been on this one long enough, and I've got one more movie lined up for this journey, so let's race on over to the finish line. So let's wrap this all up with a staple from the 90s. This era was notably less open on movies to choose from for this video, as I have seen quite a bit more here than in the other eras, like Mulan, Aladdin, The Lion King, Fantasia 2000, Beauty and the Beast. I've had a lot more of an experience here. Yeah, I've managed to see a more hefty sample from this decade than all the others, though not all of it, mind you. There were still a good handful of movies to choose from in this era. And so, based on the choices I still had yet to see for myself, I figured that my pick to try out from this point should be a Goofy movie. Of course, we all know Goofy himself. He's been presented in different forms and has been around the legacy for, well, practically forever. And I've known about his son Max for a while too, particularly through some of the other specials like
Once Upon a Christmas, Twice Upon a Christmas.
So in general, I had a pretty good idea what they were going for with this movie before even starting it up. It's the kind of standard father-child bond where the son or daughter starts getting older faster than the father expected. So he tries to make the most he can out of whatever remaining time he might have with them. It's a premise we've seen in many different scenarios, whether it's between two other characters you might have seen from a show or a movie, or maybe in real life, whether it's two local people in your neighborhood, or even yourself and someone you know personally. In that regard, it's got an easier chance of staying a little more simple and down to earth, and still coming off kinda touching for a lot of people. But even considering all that, there was one detail that still managed to catch me off guard.
They've been laughing since I can remember, but they're not gonna laugh anymore.
No way, this is a musical too? Oh, holy hell, that's awesome! Yeah, just as I had all my expectations laid out for this movie, they surprised me with a serving of songs to add more energy, interactions, and more lively substance to some of these other scenes. And yeah, sure, all the other movies we've gone through here had some musical elements to them too, but somehow this was one I was expecting them to depend solely on the story's layout and how it was directly unveiled over time. So getting to hear the songs play out for the first time, this came off as a nice treat as I was watching through. But yeah, going back to some of the other details, in advance I had a thorough understanding of a majority of the characters, especially Max and Goofy on different levels, especially through a few relatable moments in my life, and seeing more of them through
Once Upon a Christmas, Twice Upon a Christmas.
And as a result, I could already sense a good portion of the twists and directions a lot of these characters were gonna take. But one individual who surprisingly happened to throw me for a loop of all characters was Pete. Based on the snippets I've seen of him in other Disney features, he always seemed to come out of the gate as some kind of snide or raging jerk. But based on his intro scene in this movie, it didn't really seem like they were going to take that route at first. And so they successfully got me to think that there might be something else going on. And it started giving me other thoughts like, well, are they going to do something else with him then? Surely they got something in mind, otherwise they wouldn't include him. And it never hit me until we saw his son, PJ. up until that point, they really got me thinking he might have changed his ways for some reason, especially in regards to the other snippets I've seen him in, but then we see that side of him through PJ and the way he's implied to have raised him. And he even goes far to try and push Goofy into going down that kind of route with Max too, without even thinking that it might lead to a different outcome. And in this very scenario, Pete didn't seem like the pushy type he's usually shown to be, so his intentions didn't seem as obvious until the right time came. And on top of that, it can come off as a surprisingly precise analysis on how some particular people might raise their children too, and it shows whether or not they'd consider their feelings and perspectives all through that. Honestly, this was another aspect I was not expecting them to go so hard with, but it feels like they played it out in a fairly respectful way that I'm sure a lot of people can get something from. He basically had a pretty solid balance on the writing for this kind of character. He wasn't too obvious, but not too cryptic either. It also helps that Jim Cummings provided that kind of tone that fits perfectly with this character too. And speaking of, there were plenty of other cast members that did great in this movie too, like Jason Marsden and Bill Farmer with their iconic performances for Max and Goofy. And same goes for some of the side actors I recognize too, like the late Wayne Allwine for his Mickey cameo, Rob Paulson as PJ, Tevin Campbell was awesome as Powerline, and I'm sure we all fondly recognize Wallace Shawn as performance for Principal Mazur.
How about science slumber parties? Inconceivable.
Overall, while I still found plenty of the story elements and directions kinda predictable, and some long before they even happened, a lot of them still played out with a healthy load of energy, charm, and care that made this a nice watch. And maybe at some later point, I'll even check out the sequel like for most of these other movies I've gone through. But then again, who knows when I'll even have the time for those to begin with. Well, that's everything I had planned for this journey. I know this may not be something completely new, as there have been a handful of people who've made separate reaction videos to movies like these, but I still felt like twisting it up a little by doing a review marathon to make this kind of thing stand out just a little bit more. And I can certainly say after all this that, man, I've been missing out. There was certainly a lot I enjoyed from these movies, whether it was the classic elements from Snow White, Captain Hook and his portrayal by Hans Conried in Peter Pan, or a surprisingly catchy musical side to a Goofy movie, and hearing those legendary stars Alan Young and Vincent Price together in The Great Mouse Detective, as well as the inclusion of this song.
Goodbye, so soon.
I just can't get enough of that, it's so charming. And of course, the highly impressive presentation of the atmosphere, songs, and characters in The Little Mermaid. I may have never had the chance or interest to fully see through these movies in my childhood, but seeing that I still got some enjoyment through these during a blind run through in my late 20s, that shows how well most of these hold up after all this time. And don't worry, for those who might have liked watching through this, I'm not planning to leave this as a one-off kind of journey, as there are still plenty of older movies in the Disney timeline that I have yet to see even after this bunch. So maybe I'll come back to see if I can do this again sooner or later. And why stop there? We've still got plenty of animated movies from other studios that I've never seen from my childhood or any part of my life up to this point. So I could probably go more out with those other companies too, like maybe Pixar, Illumination, Sony Animation. But before any of those, based on a poll I posted on this very topic, it looks like DreamWorks is the more hyped of the possibilities here. So it looks like I'll end up checking out some of their work next, and of course this means I'll have to take time to pick out some movies from their library and find the time to actually watch however many I go with, as well as write out scripts for them all while watching, although the speed and wait time might turn out a little more in our favor. However, that mostly depends on how this video and other future videos mostly turn out depending on the feedback and reception from you fellas. But like I always say at the end of these videos, we'll soon see, won't we?